Learning goals are best when you treat them like destinations on a map. The better the map, the easier it will be to reach the destination, yes, even if you've never seen the place you're trying to go to. My friend and fellow memory expert Nelson Dellis once told me something powerful. He's climbed Mount Everest, and he said, you never have to worry about the summit. You know it exists. Others have been there before. All you have to focus on is your plan and where you're going to put your hand next. And this raises an important point. A lot of people think that learning goals must be achievable. That's the A in the so-called SMART goal formula, achievable. Frankly, I think we have every reason to believe that this is simply not true. For example, must it be achievable that we learn how to travel interstellar space in order to take action towards that goal? We don't actually know if it's going to be possible or not, but we're doing it, we're attempting it, we're doing all that we can to learn everything that we can about space. Members of our species are setting goals and going into the unknown all the time. And if space is infinite, there is no destination in the sense of Mount Everest having a summit. So what you really need is an inkling that the destination exists, not certainty. An inkling that it might be achievable, not absolute promises. So keep in mind as we dive into today's discussion that setting learning goals is not just about goals. It's also about having mental metaphors about what might be possible. And you can base those mental metaphors on images of other successful people who may not have even achieved what was possible for them as a springboard for what might be possible for you. So if you like deep dives into how to learn faster and retain that information over the long haul, this is Dr. Anthony Metivier from Magnetic Memory Method inviting you to get subscribed, hit that thumbs up to help our community in our mission to make sure the robots never forget that humans still need the great memory improvement techniques we've enjoyed for thousands upon thousands of years. And keep this in mind about mental metaphors. I make it my learning goal to learn more about memory than may be humanly possible. And when I think about learning successfully, I use the metaphors of my memory like a magnetic garden that draws the information in and holds it in place for the long term. You might laugh at that, but many studies have shown that mental metaphors work. And of course it does. As Nietzsche pointed out, it's one of the favorite techniques of the ancient Greeks, including Simonides of Kos, who is thought to be one of the originators of the memory palace technique. That wonderful ability to scale the amount of information you have in long-term memory. Now, Carol Dweck says something similar in Mindset, the new psychology of success, only she puts a bit of a twist on this idea of mental metaphors. She says we like to think of our champions and idols as superheroes who were born different from us. We don't like to think of them as relatively ordinary people who made themselves extraordinary, but they are. And one thing that ordinary people who become extraordinary have in common is not just learning goals that they mentally manage in their heads, but they write them down. Bruce Lee, for example, once wrote down on paper, starting 1970, I will achieve world fame, and from then onward till the end of 1980, I will have in my possession $10 million. I will live the way I please and achieve inner harmony and happiness. Well, that's pretty ambitious. And he definitely had an idea of where the summit of that Mount Everest was, and all he had to do was take action, action, action. Is there more to it, though? Well, yes. So let's look a bit deeper at writing and journeying into the unknown. And one quote has always stuck with me. I heard it from a business guru named Dean Jackson years ago. All wealth comes from writing. And that's just not monetary wealth. That's the wealth of relationships. That's the wealth of insight. And I've always found this to be true. It gives so many layers of wealth. And the nuance here that I found is when it comes to learning goals is to develop some procedural memory around them as well as testing. So what do I mean by procedural memory? Well, the more you write out your goals as a practice, the more you get into the habit of learning goal formation. So how do you do that? Well, it means writing out the goal several times over a few days, if not weeks. Not to mention the years I spent writing out the same goal every day, even after I had achieved the success I was looking for. Now, that wasn't OCD or any sort of obsessive behavior. It's because when I found this goal of writing for a living, I wasn't willing to stop I wanted to make sure it was so deep in my procedural memory that I would never stop. So I kept going, writing out the same goal day after day after day for years. And in a way, I still do, because now I write every day, and that itself helps create this feedback loop that continually crystallizes the behavior. So another thing that I've done, and is really powerful, is to use writing to test the learning goals. So when you commit to writing your goal over and over and over again, you're already testing the truth of the goal. Sometimes we just want an outcome for the sake of having it, but we don't actually need the outcome. So if we're not willing to write it out a couple dozen times, then probably we don't actually want that goal that bad, right? And another thing that you can do is test it out by writing a vision statement similar to the one Bruce Lee created, but in a way that divides the goal that you have in mind into two columns. Because once that you have the vision in place, you're going to have a lot of action steps. So you write down what those action steps are likely to be. You can go and reverse engineer other successful people and say, well, they started here and then they did this and then they did that. Those are all action steps. And in two columns on the page, you can separate your goal itself and each and every action step into want versus need. So this is a great testing metric, because by focusing on what you really need to learn, not just what you want to know, but what you actually need to learn in order to achieve the goal, you will be able to prioritize. And when you can prioritize and you knock down those things you need to do, you're going to wind up receiving much more of what you want, including the free time to enjoy it when you get at the end of the goal. Now, I know this process sounds challenging, but it's 100% scientific, and taking on the challenge is part of what makes it work. Angela Duckworth would likely file this kind of exercise under her concept of developing grit. Now, once you've tested that you really want to learn a particular thing and you have a goal in mind, a general idea of where you're going to wind up, get in the habit of asking where and when you're going to sit down and complete the steps that are involved in the goal. If you don't include these simple facts in your procedure of learning and the learning goal and all the steps involved, it becomes way too easy to drop the goal. Remember Nelson Dellis's advice. Where your hand goes next is important to focus on. And when you're going to make the move is also super important. Otherwise, you risk sliding down the mountain. Let me give you a quick example to make this a bit more concrete. I'm working on the second draft of a book about Giordano Bruno, the great memory master. Part of my research involves reading Shakespeare to follow up on Hilary Gaddy's suggestion that this wonderful master of memory may have influenced Shakespeare's creation of the character of Hamlet. Now, as much as I love Shakespeare, it's not exactly light reading. So I especially need to plan where and when I'm going to get the reading done. Writing the exact when and where down helps to ensure that the reading gets done. Now, there's a bit more nuance on timing to consider, because it's not just about time, it's always about space. But there's another thing. It's also about setting aside time and space for thinking about what you're learning. Not enough people schedule time to think about the material that they're cramming into their heads. But we need to gear down after focusing on reading and anything else involved in learning. And then we need to take time for what is called diffuse thinking, or simply percolation. Barbara Oakley talks a lot about this in her epic learning course, Learning How to Learn, as does Alex Pang in a wonderful book called Rest. Planning for downtime literally allows your brain to form connections, and those connections tend to be much more robust. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, I can learn while I'm resting, while I'm doing nothing? Yes, and it's an important part of any learning routine that you must put into your goals in order to optimize your learning goals, especially when you're studying tough subjects. Cramming, it can work from time to time, but it's not very good for long-term retention. And having rest and time set aside to think about what you're learning is even better when you're using memory techniques. For example, you can just lay back and wander your memory palaces. I love doing that. I know many of the people who take the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass find it tremendously relaxing to just sit there and think about what they've memorized and get it into long-term memory faster, because revisiting the information does exactly that. You are using memory palaces, aren't you? If not, you need to at least get my free course at magneticmerrymethod.com or dive directly into the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. This is because once you have your learning goals written down, let's say in Bruce Lee style, you have them thoroughly tested and you have at least a bit of repetition and you've tested them with the needs versus want analysis, you can seriously reduce the amount of time you need to spend on getting the information into long-term memory by using memory palaces, mnemonic images, and proper spaced repetition. It'll help speed up how fast you can establish long-term retention, which means you'll have time for more learning goals. Now, obviously, there are many, many topics, and there are ways to craft the perfect learning goals outline for those different topics. But that's where you come in with the specifics. Action is perfection when it comes to learning and planning your learning goals. Noting that I'm talking about perfection in a very, very specific way. Not perfectionism, but progressing day after day by taking action day after day, not willy-nilly, but with a plan. If you're learning a new language, you need to speak and learn from mistakes, something you're going to be able to do much better when you have the where and when in place, all linked to a vision and steps that you have determined in advance. Keep going in the face of those mistakes because you've already scheduled your time with the native speaker and you have no way to avoid it. It's already there for you because the when and the where has been decided. Or if you're writing a book like I am with Vitamin X, the sequel to Flyboy, it's such a complicated plot that I have to revisit my vision for the whole Memory Detective project repeatedly to keep going because let's just call a spade a spade. Even people who are well practiced at writing many, many books like I am still have challenges, still have doubts, and it has to be planned. It has to have a time, a where and a when, and it has to have that vision. Because in my case, the project follows the basic genre structures of the detective genre. And that's why this has everything to do with learning plans. I have to follow my own learning plan by not only continuing to write the book in specific places and specific times, but I have to continue to read books from the genre, which includes absorbing and remembering my observations from other people who write in the crime genre about how it ticks. And I have to keep educating myself about memory because the Memory Detective series is about a detective who uses memory techniques. So think of it this way. Well-formed learning goals always involve time management, always involve goal setting that's linked to a vision, and that is always going to need practice. You got to practice creating visions. You got to practice managing the time and the steps involved in order to achieve them. Keep humble, keep moving, one hand after the next. And if you need more help, check out my video on how to craft a well-formed learning cycle next. It's not repetition of what we've talked about today, even if there is a little bit of review of similar ideas. Thanks as always. Come visit me at magneticmerrymethod.com, and until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.